The original contract, the one buried in a filing cabinet thick with dust and deceit, explicitly called for a wholesome, family-friendly Christmas show. The final script, handwritten by Colonel Tom Parker himself in his looping, Carnival Barker scrawl, had Elvis Presley, the human earthquake, singing Silent Night in a cozy cardigan, surrounded by plastic reindeer and fake snow. A televised Christmas card sent from a king in exile. It was supposed to be his surrender. So how did a televised greeting card become a televised riot? How did the man in the cardigan become the man in black leather, a predator pacing a cage? Was this televised resurrection a moment of pure, defiant, artistic rebellion? Or was it merely the final, glorious battle in a war for his own soul that the king had already, tragically, lost? The year was 1967, and Elvis Presley was a ghost. He haunted the sound stages of Hollywood, a phantom rattling chains made of celluloid and bad scripts. While the world convulsed with change, set ablaze by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the psychedelic fury of Jimi Hendrix, Elvis was a postcard from a forgotten decade. He was a running joke, a relic singing to co-stars in bikinis and crustaceans on fake beaches. His voice, that once-in-a-generation force of nature, neutered and shrink-wrapped for soulless family matinees. He was the king of a kingdom that no longer existed, a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own making. And his warden, the man who held the key, was Colonel Tom Parker. He was not a manager, not in the traditional sense. He was a showman, a puppeteer, a master of the long con, who saw his prized client not as a revolutionary artist, but as a blue-chip stock, an asset, a prize pig to be fattened on cinematic slop and sold, piece by piece, to the highest bidder until there was nothing left but the brand. The colonel operated from the shadows, a creature of cigar smoke and backroom deals. His past a carefully constructed mirage, his grip on Elvis, absolute. The deal with the National Broadcasting Company was vintage Parker, a cool $1 million for a package, one forgettable feature film, and one television special. For the colonel, it was just another transaction, a way to keep the money machine churning. It was a simple, clean, and above all, safe way to fulfill a contractual obligation. But for Elvis, it was a lifeline, a crack of light in the velvet prison he'd inhabited for nearly a decade, a chance he didn't even know he was desperate enough to take. The network, wanting a fresh eye, brought in a young, hungry director. His name was Steve Binder. Binder wasn't a company man. He was a renegade who had helmed the legendary TAMI show, capturing the raw, untamed energy of James Brown and the Rolling Stones. He didn't see the tired movie star. He saw the caged animal pacing behind the bars. He saw the danger that the world had forgotten. During their first meeting, surrounded by the colonel's yes-men, Binder looked past the entourage and asked Elvis a question no one had dared to ask him in 10 years, a question so simple it was revolutionary. What do you want to do? Silence. Elvis Presley, the man who had bent the world to his will, had no answer. The prison door had just been unlocked by a stranger, but he had been inside for so long, he'd forgotten how to walk through it. The conspiracy began in whispers. It was nurtured in the quiet hum of an air conditioner in Elvis's rented dressing room on the NBC lot in Burbank, California. Away from the prying ears of the colonel and his ever-present spies in the Memphis Mafia, Binder and Elvis began to talk. Really talk. Binder didn't pitch ideas. He planted seeds. He brought in records, the sounds of the street, the music of the revolution that had passed Elvis by. He played him Otis Redding. He played him Bob Dylan. He didn't just talk about music. He talked about relevance. He reminded Elvis of who he was before the movies, before the army, before the myth became a trap. He spoke of the hillbilly cat, the Tupelo flash, the lightning in a bottle. Elvis was terrified. A decade of the colonel's conditioning, a relentless psychological campaign of isolation and control, had done its work. The colonel had convinced him he was nothing without him, that the world outside the Hollywood gates was hostile and unforgiving. Elvis, the symbol of rebellion, had become a docile employee, afraid of failure, afraid of irrelevance, but most of all, mortally afraid of the colonel. To defy him was unthinkable. It was professional suicide. It was like a son defying a tyrannical father. The colonel's plan was laid out in a crisp memo, a blueprint for mediocrity. The singer presents Elvis Christmas Special. A grand, sterile stage filled with fake snow and twinkling lights. A wholesome roster of guest stars. A warm, folksy opening number. And the grand finale. Elvis, in a festive sweater, wishing America a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. It was safe. It was sanitized. It was a televised embalming. The Colonel wasn't a fool. He could smell the smoke of rebellion curling from under the dressing room door. He sensed the shift in Elvis, the dangerous flicker of autonomy in his eyes. He made his move. He summoned Steve Binder to his cavernous office at the MGM Studios, a dark, wood-paneled crypt where careers went to die. It wasn't a meeting. It was an act of intimidation. Surrounded by gold records and framed photos of his prize client, the Colonel, without ever raising his voice, reminded Binder who signed the checks, who owned the asset, who could crush a young director's career with a single phone call. And to ensure compliance, to guarantee there would be no more secret conversations, he assigned one of his own men to be an associate producer, a watchdog, a spy on the set at all times. The war had gone cold. A covert operation fought in the corridors of NBC. A strange psychological schism began to tear through Elvis. By day, in official production meetings, he was the Colonel's man. He was docile, agreeable, nodding politely as the plans for the Christmas pageant were laid out. He was the good son, the obedient star, playing his part to appease the warden. But by night, the real Elvis emerged. Binder had arranged a series of informal rehearsals, reuniting Elvis with two of his original bandmates, the quiet, revolutionary guitarist Scotty Moore and the rock-solid drummer DJ Fontana. It was a reunion nearly a decade in the making. Away from the suits and the spies, in a small, stuffy room with the amps turned up loud, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't a rehearsal. It was an exorcism. He strapped on a guitar, and with the first, tentative chord, the Hollywood shell began to crack. He wasn't reading lines. He was telling stories. He laughed. A deep, guttural laugh that hadn't been heard in years. He cursed. He sweated. He stomped his foot and snarled into the microphone, and in those moments, the bland, technicolor hell of his movie career was burned away by the raw, primal fire of rock and roll. He was Elvis Presley again, but the fear was a constant shadow. He'd flinch when the door opened, half expecting the Colonel's hulking form to appear, to shut it all down. He was two men trapped in one body, the Colonel's puppet and the king he was meant to be, locked in a silent, desperate battle for control. He was fighting for his life, on a battlefield no one else could see. Then the walls began to close in from another direction. A memo arrived, not from the Colonel, but from the network itself. The top brass at NBC, the brave pioneers of television, were getting nervous. The year was 1968. America was a powder keg. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. Bobby Kennedy was dead. The cities were burning with riots, and the counterculture was at war with the establishment. And into this firestorm, they were about to unleash a sexually charged Elvis Presley? The network's Standards and Practices Department, in a memo keyed directly to Colonel Parker, expressed deep concern over Elvis's animalistic and suggestive gyrations. They were demanding the rebellion be toned down before it even began. The pressure was no longer just from the Colonel. Now the network was his co-conspirator. They had paid for the return of the king, but they were terrified of the man. The moment of truth arrived in the wardrobe department. It was there the final battle lines would be drawn. The Colonel's associate, the spy, stood watch as the pre-approved outfits were rolled out on a rack. Conservative tuxedos, casual sports coats, and of course, the now infamous selection of festive Christmas sweaters. It was a wardrobe for a neutered icon, safe and utterly forgettable. But Steve Binder and the show's costume designer, Bill Bailew, had staged their own quiet coup. In a separate room, waiting on a single mannequin, was their secret weapon. It was a suit made of black leather. It wasn't just an outfit. It was armor. It was a statement. It was a second skin tailored not for the Hollywood movie star, but for the street-fighting kid from Memphis. It was the physical manifestation of the Sun Records Phantom, a throwback to the raw, untamed danger he once represented. Bailew and Binder presented it to him in private. Elvis ran his hand over the material. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, then at the leather, then back at his reflection. The transformation was instantaneous. As he put it on, piece by piece, the years of compromise and capitulation seemed to melt away. The fit was tight, unforgiving. It forced him into a posture of defiance, a coiled, predatory stance. He looked in the mirror and he didn't see the star of Kissin' Cousins. He saw Elvis Presley. It was a declaration of war, stitched together with thread and rebellion. He made his choice. He walked out of that dressing room, straight past the horrified, gaping face of the Colonel's man, and onto the rehearsal stage. The decision was made. There would be no Christmas songs. What nobody knew, not the network, not the Colonel, not even Elvis himself at first, was that the jam sessions, the so-called informal rehearsals, were never intended to be seen by the public. They were just a warm-up, a psychological tool used by Binder to help Elvis rediscover his confidence. But Binder, in an act of breathtaking subterfuge, had instructed his cameramen to keep the tapes rolling, always. Secretly, he was filming a documentary about a man reclaiming his soul, right under the warden's nose. The raw, intimate, unplanned heart of the special, the legendary concert in the round, wasn't a happy accident. It was a carefully engineered conspiracy. The stage itself was another act of psychological warfare. Binder rejected the traditional, cavernous proscenium arch. Instead, he built a tiny, square stage, no bigger than a boxing ring, and surrounded it with a live audience. They were so close they could see the sweat on Elvis's brow, so close they could reach out and touch him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide behind elaborate sets or dancing girls. Binder was forcing intimacy. He was forcing truth. The moments before the first taping were pure terror. After 7 years away from a live audience, Elvis was convinced his career was over. He was backstage, pale and trembling, convinced they would laugh at him, that he had forgotten how to do it. He turned to Steve Binder, his eyes wide with panic. "I can't do this, man," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't go out there." He was a king about to walk into the gladiator's arena, armed only with a guitar and a fading memory of who he used to be. The Colonel, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent. He had washed his hands of Binder's rebellious production. If it failed, it was the director's fault. If it succeeded, he would take all the credit. He always did. That's when the Colonel played his final card, a desperate, scorched earth gambit to sabotage the show from within. Just hours before the taping was set to begin, Parker made a call. He pulled the plug on the show's primary sponsor, the Singer Sewing Machine Company, fabricating a story about creative insults and broken promises. With one phone call, he created a $1 million hole in the budget, a catastrophic loss he was certain would force NBC to panic, cancel the taping, and crawl back to him, begging for his safe, cheap, and now fully funded Christmas show. It was an act of financial terrorism, designed to crush the rebellion once and for all. The network executives went into a tailspin. The money was gone. The entire production was on the verge of collapse. But Binder, along with the show's producer Bob Finkel, held their ground. They called the Colonel's bluff. They would find the money. The show, they declared, would go on. Backstage, shielded from the financial chaos, Elvis took a deep breath and walked out of the darkness and into the light. The lights hit him. The roar of the small crowd was deafening. He froze. For one long, agonizing moment, he was paralyzed. The doubt was a physical weight. The years of Hollywood mediocrity, a shroud he couldn't shake. He looked out at the faces, inches away from him, and saw not adoration, but judgment. He looked lost. Then, his hand found the neck of his guitar. He strummed a chord. It was tentative, quiet. Then he strummed another. Firmer this time. He leaned into the microphone, and from the depths of his memory, he began to sing Heartbreak Hotel. But this was not the defiant snarl of 1956. This version was slower, darker, coated in the blues, and steeped in a genuine weariness. It was the sound of a man who hadn't just sung about that lonely place at the end of Lonely Street. It was the sound of a man who had taken up permanent residence there. The transformation was electric. The fear in his eyes was vaporized, replaced by a coiled, primal energy. He wasn't performing a song. He was delivering a sermon. He was testifying about his own exile. The king had come home. But while Elvis was on stage, beginning the most important performance of his life, a messenger delivered a telegram backstage. It wasn't from a fan. It wasn't from the network. It was from Colonel Tom Parker. The envelope was cold and clinical. Inside, a short strip of paper contained only 2 words. 2 words that would reframe the entire triumph of the night as something else entirely. 2 words that were not a concession, but a threat. 2 words that proved this wasn't the end of the war. It was just the beginning. On stage, the jam session had caught fire. Elvis was reborn. He was loose, funny, dangerous, and completely in command. He joked with Scotty and DJ, telling rambling, profane stories about the old days on the road. He openly mocked his own movie career, laughing at the absurdity of it all. The puppet strings hadn't just been cut. They had been publicly, joyously incinerated. He launched into Loudy Miss Claudie, and the raw, unadulterated sexuality that had terrified a generation was unleashed once more. The sneer was back. The snarl was back. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a resurrection, in real time. He wasn't just reminding the audience who he was reminding himself. He prowled the tiny stage like a panther, reclaiming his body, his voice, his legacy, one incendiary note at a time. In the control booth, the network executives sat in stunned silence. Their jaws were on the floor. They had come expecting to manage the decline of a washed-up movie star. Instead, they were witnessing the televised second coming of rock and roll. The show's iconic closing number, the anthem that would define this comeback, was never supposed to exist. It was written in a single, frantic afternoon by the show's musical director, Walter Earl Brown. He had been so devastated by the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy just weeks earlier that he channeled his grief and hope into a song. He called it, "If I Can Dream." When he played it for Elvis, the singer was deeply, profoundly moved. He brushed aside the planned Christmas medley finale and declared, "I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in." This would be his final word. He had to fight for it. The Colonel loathed it, dismissing it as a protest song. The network was terrified of its political message in such a volatile year. Elvis didn't care. It was no longer just his comeback. It was his statement to a wounded nation. The set changed. The intimate boxing ring was gone. He was standing alone now, dressed in a pristine white suit, a stark contrast to the black leather. He looked like a preacher, ready to deliver his final sermon. Behind him, a wall of towering, blood-red lights spelled out his name, Elvis. He took the microphone. He sang. The performance was not a performance at all. It was a raw, open wound. He pleaded. He begged. He raged against the darkness, his voice soaring with a desperate hope. He fell to his knees, his body convulsing with the emotion of the lyrics, his fists clenched, veins bulging on his neck. It was the most vulnerable he had ever allowed himself to be. The icon was gone. The mask was gone. All that was left was a man, bleeding his soul out for the entire world to see. The final, soaring note hung in the air, echoing in the stunned silence of the studio. He remained on his knees, head bowed, chest heaving, utterly spent. The crew was frozen. Some were openly weeping. They knew, in that moment, that they had just captured lightning in a bottle. They had witnessed something far more profound than a television special. The taping was over. A staggering, earth-shattering success. The studio was electric, buzzing with the energy of a historic event. Elvis walked backstage, drenched in sweat, physically and emotionally drained, but exhilarated. He had done it. He had faced down the Colonel, the network, and the ghost of his own past. And he had won. He had won. He pushed open the door to his dressing room. The roar of the crowd faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet. There, on the makeup table, propped against the mirror where he had confronted his own reflections so many times, was the telegram, the one that had arrived hours ago. He picked it up. His hands were still shaking, but now from adrenaline and triumph, not fear. He tore it open and read the 2 words typed by Colonel Parker. The smile vanished from his face. The fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the old, familiar look of a man on a leash. The victorious king, in his moment of absolute triumph, suddenly looked like a prisoner who had just had his parole revoked. The camera pushes in, tight on his face, as the devastating realization dawns. The victory was just an illusion. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The 2 words on the telegram weren't praise. They weren't congratulations. They were a destination, an invoice, a cage. All the fire, all the sweat, all the blood he had just left on that stage. It wasn't a declaration of independence. It was a glorified audition, a showcase to prove the product was still viable, still potent, still capable of selling tickets and filling rooms in the one place Elvis had sworn he'd never end up, the one place where real rock and roll went to die. But how could this be? Hadn't the Colonel fought him every step of the way? Hadn't he tried to sabotage the show with his demands for a schmaltzy Christmas special? Or was that, too, part of the grand manipulation? Was it possible that the Colonel never feared Elvis's rebellion? That, in fact, he had counted on it? That he had intentionally pushed Elvis into a corner, knowing the only way out was for the caged animal to roar, creating the greatest possible spectacle, and in turn, jacking up his own price tag? The truth was far more cynical, and far more brilliant, than a simple battle of wills. The Colonel wasn't fighting Elvis. He was marketing him. Las Vegas in 1968 was not the global entertainment capital it is today. It was the end of the line, a gilded graveyard where aging crooners and has-beens went to play out the string, singing their greatest hits to tourists who were more interested in the buffet and the blackjack tables. For Elvis Presley, the man who had just resurrected the very soul of rebellion on national television, It was a death sentence disguised as a residency. He had just proven he could still be the most dangerous man in music. And his reward? To become the safest bet in Nevada. The Colonel's plan was now horrifyingly clear. The TV special wasn't the victory. It was the bait. He had let Elvis run free on the shortest of leashes, just long enough for him to prove to the world and the casino bosses that he was still the king. Now the leash was being yanked, and it was attached to the International Hotel. The deal was already in motion. While Elvis was fighting for his soul in a Burbank studio, the Colonel was in Vegas, closing the most lucrative contract in entertainment history. A deal that would chain Elvis to the city for years, demanding 2 shows a night, month after month. A relentless, soul-crushing schedule that would make the Hollywood movie grind look like a vacation. It was the perfect trap. And Elvis, in his moment of greatest triumph, had just walked right into it, with the whole world watching. But why? Why this specific cage? With Elvis's star burning brighter than ever, why chain him to a single city in the desert? Why not a world tour, where the real money and glory lay? The answer reveals a secret the Colonel had guarded his entire life, a secret that makes his control over Elvis seem less like business and more like a hostage situation. The truth is, Colonel Tom Parker couldn't leave the country. He couldn't risk applying for a passport, because he wasn't Tom Parker. He was Andreas van Koekwijk, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, a man with a past he had literally run an ocean away from. And so the entire gilded cage was built around a lie. Not a business strategy, but a secret. Elvis Presley, a global icon, the most famous man on the planet, could never tour the world because his manager, the man who controlled his every move, was a man on the run from his own past. The king of rock and roll was a prisoner of a ghost from a small town in the Netherlands. Every offer to play in London, Tokyo, or Sydney, offers that would have re-energized his spirit and cemented his global legacy, was turned down. Not for Elvis's sake, but for the Colonel's. The world was calling for the king, but his keeper had locked the gates of the kingdom and thrown away the key, shrinking Elvis's entire world to a 2-mile stretch of desert highway. The '68 comeback special wasn't a rebirth. It was a final, brilliant flash of lightning before the storm of routine settled in for good. The black leather of the rebel was traded for the white jumpsuits of the resident act. The dangerous, unpredictable artist was replaced by the reliable nightly headliner. 2 shows a night, the same songs, the same moves. The roar of the crowd became the soundtrack to his isolation, a constant reminder of the adoration of a world he was forbidden to visit. The man who sang of breaking free, of leaving the building, could never truly leave the building. This is the ultimate tragedy of Elvis Presley. Not the fall from grace, but the containment of greatness. The '68 special proved the fire was not only still there, it was burning hotter than ever. But instead of being allowed to blaze across the globe, it was used to light up a casino marquee, night after monotonous night, until there was little left but embers and smoke. He was a symbol of freedom for millions, trapped by the lie of one man. The story of Elvis Presley is more than the music. It is a cautionary tale, a human drama, a battle for the soul of an icon. The legend is vast, but the truth is what gives it meaning. To understand the king, we must first understand the man and the cage he was put in. If you believe his story deserves to be told with passion and truth, subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories. Join us as we continue to separate the man from the myth.